What I'm trying to do is actually reasonably replace hormones at a level, a dosage that would create serum levels that are reasonably comparable to the levels that a woman would have at her healthiest stage of life, say when she's in the early 20s. What became the norm and really the beaten into the ground kind of a policy was low dose. So low dose became the norm. So anything above that was considered a supraphysiologic. But in reality, there was so much fear that was created after the Women's Health Initiative study came out over and was stopped over 20 years ago now, that the mantra of less is best and avoid if possible really became the mandate almost in terms of what all the medical societies recommended. And it really became the foundation of how future studies were even designed, which is really sad. The amount of research is never enough. And most of the research that has been done has been in other animals, particularly rodents, which is a reasonable but not an identical replacement for human effects. And it's really very contrived how they actually create these models in rodents. But we do have some data in humans. And in humans, we know that unless you cross the line and have at least a 50 picogram per mil level in the blood, you're not going to do anything beneficial for vaginal health. And that's not even a high amount, but you really can't just give a whiff and systemically and then have vaginal improvement. The same thing with the bone. They've shown that the amount of estradiol that's delivered will have an effect on bone. So if you have a little tiny bit, it might help and could, and so it's not insignificant, help to prevent bone loss. But in terms of building bone, you have to have a higher amount. There was some data showing that if you're using the estradiol patch, you have to get up to the highest dose of the patch, the 0.1 milligram, in order to have the potential to grow any bone. There is a dose effect, and there's a lot of research showing it's like a bimodal effect of estradiol, kind of comparable to a menstrual cycle, which is a really good role model for estradiol levels and the effects. Something like 75% of all the practitioners, whether they're nurse practitioners or PAs or MDs or DOs, they were not practicing medicine 20-ish years ago when the Women's Health Initiative came out. You know, they went through their medical education at a time when menopausal education was pretty non-existent. There was like no approach. It was like hands off. It's life, lady, just chalk it up. You know, that's it. You know, and I still hear patients get those kind of lines from going to doctors. It's like, you know what, this is part of aging. This is life. Goodbye, there's the door. Because it's like, we don't do anything. We don't treat it. It's natural. These doctors and other healthcare professionals were taught to avoid hormones. It's really a challenge. During the time when the Women's Health Initiative came out, I begged and pleaded with my patients to stay on hormones, that this made no sense. So about half of them, no matter what I did, about half of them went off. But of the ones who stayed on and stayed with me, oh my gosh, they have really defined what healthy aging is. I hope that that's what I am. I'm trying to be a super ager and a role model that staying on hormones and trying to keep the levels to a reasonably physiologic semblance, you know, so it's similar-ish. I wish we could make like a new set of ovaries. And there are people actually researching that, you know, how we could have true ovarian function that goes on for another 20 years. And I would sign up for that. But we don't have that clinically available yet. We make the best of it. But the patients who stayed with the hormones, and that I have been fortunate enough that they didn't move out of the area, they're doing amazingly well. They did not develop osteoporosis. Their vascular system, and we measure vascular health in my office. I look at echocardiograms looking for the signs of energy deficiency, which occurs in an estrogen deficiency heart, which is called mild diastolic dysfunction, which is a stiffer heart, an energy deficient heart. I see that in women who went off hormones or were on minuscule insufficient doses, which is so sad. But the women who stayed with it, you know, this is clinical observation. So it's not considered in our world today to be the highest level of scientific evidence. But if you think about how we learned as a scientific community, predating big pharma and the origins of placebo-controlled double-blinded studies. We didn't learn by doing the big pharma type studies. We didn't do that. We learned by observation, clinical acumen. If I use that, the old-fashioned observational tools of learning and scientific evidence, which now, like I said, is not considered the highest level of evidence, then I would say my observation is that women who were on physiologic-ish levels of hormones, and not just physiologic levels, and this is another big deal, replicating somewhat the rhythms of a menstrual cycle, which is not what has become the norm as well. For no obvious reason, it's become the norm. Well, there is actually a reason, but it's not a medical reason. It's a social reason, which is not the same. Social reasons could be, I like to eat at midnight. That's not a medical reason for eating at midnight. It's not a medically justified position to use static dosing. But if you use rhythmic dosing, where you're cyclic dosing, those women did the best. This is like observation and not, a controlled study. I have no control group to compare to, but I can tell you that my observation is giving optimal doses, creating physiologic levels, and giving cyclic progesterone and maintaining a cycle with bleeding in women who have a uterus, which is not the standard anymore. But like I said, it's a social reason, not a medical reason. Those women did great, and they look younger too. I absolutely believe that the optimal way of giving hormones would be truly to replicate the rhythms of a healthy, normal menstrual cycle, which, as you said, the amounts of estrogen in the form of estradiol is variable throughout, if we say a 28-day cycle. Like I said earlier, you have this, it starts low, it rises, it spikes, it comes dips, and then it comes back up. And then you have the progesterone, and it starts low, and it sort of goes into a plateau, and then it would come down if you're not pregnant. That definitely need to get more research. I think that would be ideal. That is not a common, that's like a real outlier to do that. That's a super outlier. I really think that will ultimately be the case. However, I also have to recognize that is really complicated for a lot of women to do, because you're going to have a regimen where the amount of estradiol and progesterone is going to vary throughout a 28-day cycle. And that's really complex for a lot of people to manage. In the process, women, like we'll say, once their ovaries have now stopped making hormones, they're the easiest ones, because I'm not having to fight with their own ovarian function anymore. So you're right, though, perimenopause is a challenging time because women are making their own hormones and it's unpredictable. If possible, I like to get a menstrual mapping, and there are a number of companies that do these cycle mapping where you can actually collect urine through multiple times during the menstrual cycle. And it's amazing how some women who are, say, 45 and they still have regular cycles, but they don't feel right. Their sleep is impacted, their mood, they may have palpitations, they may even have some night sweats, and they just don't feel themselves. They really feel different. And when you do the cycle mapping, you see that everything is like miniaturized. Their estradiol spike, instead of being like that, is like that. Their progesterone peak, instead of being like that, is like that. Mm-hmm. And those women, I give them supplemental hormones. So in the perimenopause, I call it hormone supplementation. And in the menopause, I call it hormone replacement. So it's supplement. Now, I always tell women that you're a moving target. We have to be resilient, and we have to be, sort of like adventurous, to do this. But so I call it a safety net. When I give hormones in the perimenopause, it's like a safety net. It keeps them from falling too low. It's not suppressive. It's not like birth control pills, which shuts their own ovarian function off. It's additive. So I say, I'm not controlling your own hormones to any great degree here. So if you have wacky hormones, I'm just giving you a baseline, a safety net, so that the goal is so that you don't have huge fluctuations, because part of the huge fluctuations is because the estradiol level will get too low. So the brain, which has sensors to the estrogen, says, oh, not enough estrogen. So it shoots out through the pituitary higher amounts of LH and FSH. So suddenly the ovaries, which still can respond, they're not lost to function yet. They still have some capability. They will shoot suddenly like super high doses of estradiol because the FSH and LH went so high. And then the brain says, whoa, now there's too much. So then the FSH goes down. So then the level goes down. So it's like a roller coaster. So by giving sort of foundational safety net hormones, it hopefully will keep those huge surges. Now, you can still have some craziness, but hopefully you don't have the giant ups and the giant downs, the giant ups and downs, which is what triggers migraines and mood swings and breast tenderness and sleep problems, all that. Like, whoa, it's like, what's happening here? So to try to just sort of be on a more even keel.